It was a quiet summer evening in 1975 in the small town of Cartersville, Georgia. The kind of place where the air smelled of pine and distant rain, and everyone knew everyone by name. The days moved slow and the nights were wrapped in crickets and porch-light silence. But on one July night, that peaceful rhythm shattered forever. That night, 24-year-old Grace Mallory vanished. She wasn't a celebrity, not even someone the newspapers would have noticed in any other circumstance. Grace was a local school teacher, loved for her patience and laughter. Her classroom was filled with hand-painted posters, bright construction paper, and the sweet smell of chalk dust. Children adored her. They said she made every story come alive. She was engaged to a young mechanic named Daniel Rhodes, and their wedding was only 3 months away. But on that summer night, Grace walked out of her small blue house after dinner, carrying a library book under her arm. She told her neighbor she was heading to the town library to return it before closing. She never came back. By sunrise, everything had changed. When Grace didn't show up at the library drop box or at home, Daniel began to worry. He called her sister Marilyn, who lived 2 towns over, and then the local police. At first, the officers assumed Grace had perhaps gone to visit someone or stayed overnight with a friend. But when her car was found abandoned near Etowah River Bridge, doors locked, keys still in the ignition, that theory vanished. The search began the next morning. Dozens of residents joined, combing the brush along the riverbanks. Her father, Samuel Mallory, a retired postman, walked the woods himself, calling her name again and again. "Gracie," he yelled until his voice broke. For days there was nothing. No footprints, no purse, no sound. By the 3rd day, officers from the Bartow County Sheriff's Office brought in dogs and divers. The river was dragged, the field searched, and the woods beaten down by boot after boot. One of Grace's shoes was discovered near a dirt path not far from her car. It was a white canvas flat, still clean, as if placed there deliberately. The detail haunted detectives. When the dogs caught a faint scent near the tree line, hope flared, until a thunderstorm rolled in that night, washing away nearly everything. The next morning, the trail was gone. Days turned into weeks. Flyers went up across Georgia. Churches held vigils. Reporters came, asked questions, then left when there was nothing new to print. The story slowly slipped off the front pages, but not out of people's hearts. Grace's parents refused to move her things from her house. Her classroom stayed exactly as it was, pencils still in cups, chalk still lined up in neat white sticks. The town changed after that summer. People began locking their doors earlier. Women stopped walking alone at night. The laughter that once filled Main Street felt thinner somehow. Detective Harold Vance, a seasoned investigator in his 40s, led the case. He had seen missing person reports before, teenagers running away, family disputes, but something about this case crawled under his skin. Grace wasn't the type to vanish. He spent long nights at his desk, cigarette smoke rising into the yellow light of the precinct. The file grew thicker by the week. Interviews, polygraph tests, witness statements, all leading nowhere. Daniel, Grace's fiancé, was questioned several times. He was devastated, barely able to speak. His alibi checked out. He'd been working a late shift at the auto shop the night Grace disappeared. He'd called her around 8 p.m., and she told him she was heading to the library. The last confirmed sighting was at Pineview Road near the bridge. A farmer said he saw a small blue car parked there around 8:45 p.m. with its headlights off. He noticed a second vehicle behind it, a dark pickup truck, maybe green or blue. But the farmer couldn't recall the plate number or make. That detail became the case's first and only lead. By September 1975, the search officially scaled back. Vance hated calling it a cold case, but that's what it was becoming. Grace's parents still came to the station every Sunday after church, bringing coffee and homemade pie as if their kindness could will the truth into appearing. Then, in late October, hikers found a piece of fabric deep in the woods off Highway 41, nearly 12 miles from where Grace's car had been found. It was a torn scrap from a floral dress. Marilyn confirmed it. It was the same pattern Grace wore the night she vanished. Search teams returned. A few yards away, buried under pine needles and leaves, they found what everyone feared. Grace Mallory's remains were discovered in a shallow grave, partially covered by branches. Her engagement ring still glimmered faintly under the dirt. The autopsy confirmed she had died the same night she disappeared. Cause of death: blunt force trauma to the head. The news shattered Cartersville. For a town that had long prided itself on safety and decency, the realization that one of their own had been taken and killed was unbearable. Detective Vance focused on the only clue: the mysterious pickup truck. Locals said a man named Richard Bell owned an old green Ford and was seen in that area around the time. Bell was 29, worked as a delivery driver, and had a reputation for heavy drinking. He'd been arrested twice for fighting, but nothing serious. When questioned, Bell denied ever knowing Grace. He said he'd been home alone that night watching television. His story was weak, but there wasn't enough to hold him. Without physical evidence, no fingerprints, no blood, no witnesses, the case stalled. Vance kept the case file on his desk long after it was officially closed. Every few months he'd revisit it, make a few calls, chase down tips that went nowhere. The years blurred together. He retired in 1989, the file still unsolved. But Grace's family never let it go. Marilyn became the keeper of her sister's story. She moved to Atlanta, worked as a nurse, and spoke about Grace at community safety events. Every anniversary, she placed fresh lilies by the Etowah Bridge no matter the weather. Someone out there knows, she'd say. Someone's carrying that secret. Time marched on. The 1980s faded into the 1990s. DNA testing arrived. But the evidence from Grace's case had been badly degraded. The few biological samples collected in 1975 had been stored in glass vials and paper envelopes, long before forensic protocols were standardized. By the time newer labs looked at it, most of it was unusable. Still, the Bartow County Sheriff's Office reopened the case in 2001 as part of a state cold case review initiative. New detectives, new technology, and the same haunting question: who killed Grace Mallory? The evidence boxes, old and yellowed, were pulled from storage. Among them was a faded envelope marked "Recovered from Scene 1975. Inside was the torn fabric, the shoe, and a single small metal button. The button had a unique design, a half-star engraving. At the time, it had never been matched to any known clothing brand. In 2001, forensic examiners retested it. Trace amounts of DNA were extracted, barely enough to generate a partial profile. It wasn't enough for a match, but it gave investigators hope that one day, as the national DNA databases grew, they might find a hit, and then, like before, the trail went cold again. By 2018, more than 4 decades had passed. The town had changed, new stores, new faces, but people still remembered Grace Mallory. Her photograph still hung in the sheriff's hallway, smiling, youthful, frozen in time. That year, a young detective named Leah Carter joined the department. She was 32, analytical and driven. Her grandmother had known the Mallory family. On her first week, she saw Grace's file stacked among others in the cold case room, and something about the name caught her eye. She asked her captain if she could review it. "If you've got time between active cases," he said, shrugging. Leah began reading the reports late into the night. The old photos were grainy, the handwriting almost faded, but she could feel the life behind those pages, a woman who deserved answers. When Leah came across the note about the half-star button, something clicked. She recognized that pattern from an online database of vintage military surplus gear. The design was used on certain work jackets sold only in limited runs during the 1970s, mostly through regional hardware stores. She started digging. And with that, the case that had haunted Cartersville for nearly 40 years was about to stir again. The long hunt for justice, and the one that began on a Summer night in 1975 was finally waking up. Detective Leah Carter didn't believe in coincidences, only patterns waiting to be uncovered. When she stumbled upon the old photo of that engraved metal button, her curiosity became obsession. The file said the button was found near where Grace's remains had been buried, not on her dress, but on the ground beside her. The lab in 1975 had logged it as miscellaneous item, possibly unrelated. But to Leah, there were no miscellaneous things in a murder scene. Everything told a story. She studied the photo again. The design, a half-star etched on one side, slightly tarnished, matched what she'd seen in an online catalog of vintage uniforms. It looked like it came from a 1970s work jacket, specifically a brand distributed to factory and warehouse workers in the Southeast. She traced down the manufacturer, Baldwin & Sons Workwear Co., once based in Tennessee but defunct since 1986. Their old distribution logs, however, still existed in archived microfilm records. After weeks of patient digging, Leah found something. Baldwin & Sons had supplied jackets with those buttons to Southern Transit Hauling, a trucking company headquartered right in Cartersville in the 1970s. Grace's suspected killer might have worked there. Southern Transit had long since dissolved, but payroll records from 1974-1976 were preserved in county archives. Leah requested copies. There were about 40 employees listed, most long retired or deceased. She cross-referenced each name with police reports, criminal records, and even old newspaper mentions. One name froze her. Richard Bell. The same man Detective Vance had questioned in 1975. Bell had worked as a part-time driver for Southern Transit during that period. Leah's pulse quickened. Bell had owned a green Ford pickup, just like the one the farmer saw near Grace's car. It wasn't proof, but it was more than coincidence now. It was a thread connecting the past to the present. She dug further. Bell had left Georgia in 1976, moving to Florida, then Alabama. Over the decades, he'd racked up a few minor offenses, DUIs, trespassing, but nothing major. He'd never married. He was still alive. Leah requested the old evidence box again and sent the items to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, GBI, for modern reanalysis. Forensics had advanced tremendously since the early 2000s. Techniques, like touch DNA and enhanced low-copy number extraction, could recover genetic material from items once thought useless. When she submitted the items, the fabric, the shoe, and especially that button, she felt a strange stillness, like a door she'd waited her whole career to open was finally cracking. The lab told her it would take weeks. She spent that time poring through Vance's handwritten notes, tracing every step of his original investigation. It was like reading a map drawn in fading ink, but she could feel his frustration, his dedication. On one page he'd scribbled, "If only science could see what eyes can't." Leah smiled softly. 40 years later, science could. 3 weeks later, her phone rang. It was the GBI lab director. "Detective Carter," he said. "You might want to sit down for this. They had found a full DNA profile, recovered from the underside of the button's rim. It wasn't Grace's. The sample was male, and when entered into the combined DNA index system CODIS, it matched a criminal offender profile from Alabama, Richard Bell." Leah sat silent for a moment, staring at her computer screen. The name that had haunted Cartersville for decades was suddenly, indisputably connected to Grace Mallory's death. Bell, now 73, lived in a small town outside Birmingham. He was retired, drawing Social Security, mostly keeping to himself. Neighbors described him as polite but distant. Leah and her captain coordinated with Alabama authorities to quietly verify his identity and collect confirmatory samples. A warrant was issued, and undercover agents obtained a discarded coffee cup from a diner he frequented. The DNA from that cup matched the sample from the button, a perfect, 100% match. After 43 years, the name Richard Bell wasn't just a rumor or suspicion. It was fact. Leah couldn't stop thinking about Grace's family. Her parents had passed away long ago, but her sister Marilyn was still alive, now in her late 60s, living in Atlanta. Leah drove down to see her personally, refusing to let the news come over the phone. When Marilyn opened the door, her face lit up with cautious curiosity. "You must be with the sheriff's office," she said softly. "You look like your grandmother." Leah nodded. "She told me stories about you and Grace," she said gently. "Can I come in?" They sat at the kitchen table where framed photographs lined the walls. Grace smiling with her students. Grace and Daniel at a summer fair. Grace in her white dress holding a book to her chest. "I've been waiting a long time for someone to knock on that door," Marilyn said. Leah took a deep breath. "We've found the man responsible for your sister's death." Marilyn froze. Her hand trembled on her teacup. "You're sure?" "We have his DNA," Leah said. "His name is Richard Bell. He worked near Cartersville back then. The evidence matches." Tears filled Marilyn's eyes, not of shock but of long-awaited relief. "I knew it," she whispered. "I always knew it was someone from town." She reached for a small box on a shelf and opened it. Inside was Grace's engagement ring, still shining faintly after all these years. "She never got to wear this," Marilyn said, "but she'll finally rest knowing someone remembered her." The following month, in cooperation with Alabama State Police, Richard Bell was arrested at his home without incident. He appeared frail but alert, using a cane. When told he was being charged in connection with the 1975 murder of Grace Mallory, his expression didn't change. He said only 5 words. "I don't remember that night." But the DNA didn't lie. When news broke of the arrest, Cartersville, now a bustling commuter town where Amber was stunned. People who had grown up hearing the story on whispers and local folklore watched the headlines flash across TV screens. Cold case solved after 43 years. Arrest made in Grace Mallory murder. For many older residents, it was like a ghost finally being named. Detective Leah Carter stood at the press conference that day, surrounded by flashing cameras and microphones. She spoke clearly, her voice steady. Grace Mallory's case represents what persistence, technology, and compassion can achieve when time itself seems like the enemy. This investigation began before I was born. Today we honor both her memory and the work of those who refused to forget her. She glanced toward Marilyn, who sat in the front row, tears glistening in her eyes. In Alabama, Bell was extradited to Georgia to stand trial. Though decades had passed, the physical evidence, preserved and retested, was admissible. Prosecutors built a careful, methodical case. The location of his vehicle near the bridge, his employment records tying him to the jacket brand, and the irrefutable DNA match. Public defenders argued that memory fades, that evidence ages, that a man in his 70s couldn't possibly stand trial for something he barely recalls. But the jury didn't see age. They saw accountability finally catching up. During the pre-trial hearings, Leah often thought about Detective Vance. She located his daughter through old department records and sent her a letter. "Your father began something in 1975 that we've finally finished. Grace's story won't be forgotten, and neither will his work." The daughter replied weeks later with a note that simply read, "He always said someone would find the truth. Thank you for being that someone." In the months leading to trial, Leah visited Grace's grave for the first time. It was a small headstone beneath an old oak tree in the town cemetery. Someone, likely Marilyn, had kept the flowers fresh. Leah stood there quietly, hands clasped, as wind rustled through the leaves. "We found him," she whispered. "It took a lifetime, but we did." When the trial began in late 2019, the courtroom was packed. Local news crews filled every seat. Marilyn sat beside Leah, clutching a locket containing Grace's photo. The prosecution's narrative was simple but powerful. A young teacher abducted on her way home, a chance encounter turned deadly, and a killer who thought time would hide his crime. They presented the old items one by one, the fabric, the button, the photo of Grace's car under the bridge. Every exhibit felt like a piece of the past brought back to life. Leah testified calmly, explaining how modern DNA techniques had identified Bell. "Science doesn't forget," she told the jury. When Bell took the stand, his voice was weak. "I didn't kill anyone," he insisted. "I don't even remember that girl." But prosecutors showed that his jacket had once been standard issue for Southern Transit drivers, that his vehicle matched eyewitness accounts, and that his DNA was literally at the scene where Grace's body was buried. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When the verdict was read, guilty of murder, Marilyn closed her eyes and exhaled, as if letting go of decades of waiting in a single breath. Leah placed a hand on her shoulder. "It's over," she whispered. Marilyn nodded. "No," she said quietly. "It's finally beginning." The courthouse steps were bathed in sunlight the day the verdict was announced. Reporters rushed forward, cameras clicking, the sound echoing like a slow applause for justice finally done. For a town that had lived with silence for 44 years, it was the sound of release. Inside, Marilyn Mallory remained seated long after the jury had left. She stared at the empty witness stand where her sister's name had been spoken again and again, each time like a prayer that never lost meaning. Grace's face had returned to the front pages, not as a victim lost, but as a woman finally remembered. Detective Leah Carter stood quietly in the aisle, watching Marilyn. The two women, one who had waited a lifetime and one who had made that waiting end, shared a long, wordless moment. "She'd be proud," Leah said softly. Marilyn smiled faintly. "Grace always believed in happy endings," she whispered. "I just didn't think we'd get one." Outside, the air smelled of rain, though the sky was clear. Town residents gathered by the steps, some holding signs with Grace's photo, others simply standing in silence. For many, she had become more than a memory. She was a symbol of the community's endurance. One elderly woman who had once been Grace's student approached Marilyn. "She taught me how to read," the woman said, tears streaking her face. "All these years I kept that book she gave me. She told me that stories never die. They just wait to be told again." Marilyn nodded, squeezing her hand. Then this was her story being told again. The case closed, but the echoes remained. Richard Bell was sentenced to life in prison without parole, though his health was already failing. He rarely spoke during the proceedings and never confessed. Some thought he'd carry the truth to his grave. But for Marilyn, confession didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that Grace's name had been spoken in a court of law, that her story had been given the dignity of justice. When the sentencing ended, Bell was led away in handcuffs, his cane tapping against the floor. Leah watched him go, thinking of the decades he'd lived freely while Grace's family carried their grief. Time had given him gray hair and frailty, but it hadn't erased the past. A week later, Leah drove back to Cartersville alone. The town felt both familiar and changed. New stores, new homes, but the same quiet streets. She parked near the Etowah River Bridge where Grace's car had been found so long ago. It was peaceful now. The water shimmered beneath the afternoon sun, moving slow and steady. Leah walked to the railing and rested her hands on the cool metal. She imagined that night in 1975, Grace parking her car, perhaps pausing to look at the water, unaware that danger waited nearby. She imagined the fear, the confusion, the silence that followed. And then she pictured the years, all those endless years, that her story lay buried under dust and unsolved files. Now, at last, the silence had been broken. Leah took a small bouquet of lilies from her bag and placed them on the railing. "You were never forgotten," she whispered. "You just needed time to be heard." The following months brought an unexpected ripple of change. Grace Mallory's story inspired a statewide initiative known as the Grace Project, a collaboration between local sheriffs, the GBI, and universities to re-examine unsolved crimes from the 1960s through the 1990s. Leah was asked to help lead the review program. Her persistence had become a model for young investigators who believed old evidence still held new answers. When she first stood before a room of recruits, she began with a single sentence. Every file you touch once belonged to someone who mattered to somebody. Behind her, a photograph of Grace smiled from the projector screen. Meanwhile, Marilyn began writing a book, not a crime story but a memoir about her sister's life. She titled it The Light Under the Bridge. It wasn't about tragedy. It was about memory, love, and the way one person's kindness could ripple across decades. When the book was published a year later, the dedication read, "For Grace, the teacher who taught us that time cannot bury truth." The proceeds went towards scholarships for aspiring teachers in Bartow County, ensuring Grace's name lived on in classrooms filled with laughter and learning, just the way she would have wanted. One spring afternoon, Leah and Marilyn met at the town cemetery. The air was warm, the grass green with new life. They stood together before Grace's headstone. Someone, maybe a former student, had left a small stack of handwritten notes there. Each one began the same way. "Dear Miss Mallory, thank you for believing in me." Marilyn smiled. "She'd love this," she said. "She'd probably correct the spelling," Leah joked softly. And they both laughed, the kind of laughter that carried healing in it. Later that day, Leah drove to the sheriff's office where a small ceremony was being held. The department was dedicating a new wing of its archives, the Harold Vance Cold Case Room. His daughter attended, holding a framed photo of her father. Leah stood beside her as the ribbon was cut. "He'd be proud of you," the woman told her. "He always said one day someone young would pick up where he left off." Leah smiled. He left a good trail to follow. In the months that followed, other cold cases began to reopen across Georgia. Families long forgotten received calls they never expected. The Grace Project grew into a statewide task force. Each solved case became another small victory, another whisper of closure for those still waiting. But for Leah, none would ever compare to Grace Mallory. Sometimes late at night, she'd open the old case file, now sealed and stamped solved. The pages smelled faintly of dust and old paper, but to her, it smelled like something sacred. She kept a copy of Grace's photograph on her desk, not as a reminder of death but of determination. One evening, as she packed up her things, she noticed the sunset bleeding across the horizon outside the precinct window. Gold, rose and violet streaks spreading over the quiet Georgia hills. It looked almost like the world was exhaling after a long breath. She thought of Grace walking into that same golden light in 1975, unaware of how her story would one day connect strangers, inspire justice, and prove that even forgotten voices can echo across generations. Leah whispered, "We found you, Grace. And you found us too." Marilyn lived to see her book reach thousands. She often spoke at community events telling others that persistence, not revenge, not bitterness, was the key to healing. Justice isn't just a courtroom word, she'd say. It's a promise we keep, even when no one's watching. On the 45th anniversary of Grace's death, the town held a memorial by the river. Dozens gathered, young and old, teachers, police officers, families. Candles flickered along the bridge railing. As the crowd stood in silence, Marilyn stepped forward holding her sister's engagement ring. The same ring that had been found near her grave. She placed it into the river, letting it sink beneath the rippling surface. She waited long enough, she whispered. The water caught the sunlight, and for a moment it looked like the ring had turned into a spark, a tiny flash of light vanishing into forever. That night, Leah drove home in silence, the hum of the highway steady beneath her tires. She replayed the entire journey in her mind. The button, the DNA, the trial, the laughter at the cemetery. It all felt like pieces of one great puzzle that finally fit. When she reached her driveway, she sat for a while watching the stars. They shone clear and steady, the same way they must have the night Grace disappeared. Only now they felt different, brighter somehow. It struck her that justice, when it finally comes, doesn't roar. It whispers. It moves gently, like light returning after years of darkness. And in that moment, Leah realized something simple yet profound. Grace Mallory had never really been gone. Her kindness lived in the lives she'd touched, in her sister's courage, in the new detectives inspired by her case. She had become part of the story of everyone who refused to give up. The next morning, Leah visited the elementary school where Grace had once taught. A small plaque now hung outside the library door. In memory of Grace Mallory, 1951-1975, beloved teacher, cherished sister and enduring light. Children's laughter filled the hallways, echoing down the corridors, a sound so alive that Leah couldn't help but smile. She touched the plaque gently and whispered, "You did it, Grace. You made them believe again." Months later, when autumn rolled in and the leaves began to fall, Leah received a letter in the mail. It was from a young detective in another county who had reopened a 1980s missing person case after hearing about the Grace Project. The note was simple. "Your work reminded me why I joined this job. If you ever wonder whether what you did mattered, it did." Leah folded the letter and slipped it into Grace's file, right beside the old photograph. She knew then that some stories never truly end. They just pass from one set of hands to another, lighting the way forward. That winter, Richard Bell died in prison. The official report listed heart failure. There were no visitors, no family listed in his records. His body was cremated and his ashes scattered quietly. The past had finally folded in on itself. When Leah heard the news, she didn't feel triumph and only stillness. Some endings didn't need words. The following spring marked the grand opening of the Grace Mallory Memorial Library at Cartersville Elementary. The building stood near the old bridge, sunlight spilling through wide glass windows. Children gathered for the ribbon cutting, waving little paper bookmarks printed with a quote from Grace's journal that Marilyn had discovered while writing her book. "Even if no one remembers me by name, let them remember the stories I helped them tell." Leah attended the ceremony. As the ribbon fell, laughter and applause rose into the air. The sound mingled with the river nearby. A soft, endless murmur, like time itself whispering thank you. That evening, as the sun dipped low, Leah drove past the bridge one last time. The lilies she had left months earlier were gone, replaced by new ones, fresh, white, untouched. Someone else had remembered. She pulled over, stepped out, and let the cool evening wind wrap around her. The water below gleamed gold. For the first time in decades, Cartersville felt whole again. And as the last light faded, Leah smiled, because justice, after all those years, had finally come home.